In this video, we'll be covering how to make stuff like this, or even this. This is a technique that I've been messing around with for a few months at this point, and I found it really fun to work with, and I thought I would share it in a video so that anybody else who might want to make something like this has the tools to do so. I'm definitely not the first person to do something like this. I found a pattern on the Barocco website for a shape that's like this, also based on a dodecahedron, but the technique used in their pattern versus what I do is just slightly different. So I want to make a video on the way I approach this sort of thing. The crochet stitches used in this technique are also all fairly simple, fairly basic. The difficult part is the fact that you're sort of designing your own thing with this for the most part. So if you're not super comfortable freehanding your own crochet patterns or anything like that, you might find this a little bit trickier, although I have tried to outline every step you would need to take if you were to go about this and design your own shape like this. This is definitely meant to be more of a crochet technique tutorial rather than like a pattern walkthrough. So keep that in mind as we go through this. I will be using an example of making one of these when we get to the point of like how these things are actually constructed, but most of the steps for your own designs will be left up to you to figure out. Also, if you couldn't tell by all of these being really geometric, we're focusing on the geometric application of this in this video. There's definitely others, but I find the geometric side really fun. You don't need to know a ton about math. There's a smaller section later on that will get a little bit more in depth, but we're going to be really focusing on sort of basic polyhedra and stuff that's made up of triangles, squares, pentagons. So don't worry too much if you're not a math person. I've kept it as basic as I can for this. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get into the stitches you're going to need to know for this technique. All you're going to really need to know for this technique are a single crochet, an invisible decrease, and a foundation single crochet. I have tutorials for all of those on my channel and on my website, depending on what your preference is for learning stitches. Technically, you'll also need to know how to do a standing single crochet. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially if you have a slip knot on your hook, you aren't chaining and working back into the chain. You are working directly into an existing piece, with that slip knot becoming the top of your single crochet when you finish. I'll do a tutorial on that once we get to use it, but it's really not super hard. I don't have a tutorial up for that one, but it's pretty simple to learn. Also, before we get into the math, I want to do a little bit of an explanation on how this technique is going to work. So the basics of this, if you look at one of these, or this one's a little bit easier, you can see that there's a bunch of these little spikes. Essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be crocheting the base of the spike and working up to the point. That's where our foundation single crochets come in. We will be working a foundation single crochet around the perimeter of each of the faces of our shape, turning that into a loop, and then from there that will work into a point. Any subsequent points or spikes, however you want to call them, will be worked directly into the bases of existing spikes, with foundation single crochets being used to extend and work the rest of the perimeter of the face. All right, now we're going to get into a little bit of the math of this. Again, I've tried to keep this as basic as possible, with a second section later on that goes a little bit more in depth into some of the neat things you'll need to keep in mind if you want to take this and sort of go off on your own with it. We are going to be focusing on the platonic solids. That's these guys here, there's 5 of them. If you play D&D, you will know them as some of the dice, basically all of the dice except your percentile dice, which are these weird little diamond-y shaped ones. All of these guys are going to be your platonic solids. These are probably the most familiar to people. They're also probably the easiest to wrap your head around, seeing as they each have faces that are all the same. We don't have stuff where we have like triangular and square faces all in the same shape, so they're the easiest to wrap your head around. They also only deal with what are called regular polygons, so each of the faces have the same sides and everything. So we're really only focused on equilateral triangles, squares, that is more of a rectangle, but that's okay, and regular pentagons, so that means each of these sides is the same length and each of these angles are the same. That's what regular means. So like I said earlier, we're going to be using a foundation single crochet to outline the perimeter of each of our faces. The length of that foundation single crochet ring is mainly going to be determined by the side lengths of whatever shape we're working on. We're going to measure that in terms of stitches because we're crocheting this, and that just makes the most sense to measure sides with. I don't recommend going below a side length of 3 with this. 3 is already a little bit tricky to work with, and 2 or 1 stitches would probably get a little bit too cylindrical or be even more difficult to work into with this technique. So we're going to select a side length. If I say my side length was 3, for example, that means that I would then multiply my side length by number of sides of my shape to get the overall perimeter. So for example, this triangle has 3 sides. 3 times 3 is 9. If we were to have a side length of 3 for this square, 3 times 4 is 12, and a side length of 3 with a 5-sided pentagon would be 15. And you don't have to do 3 by any means. This guy has triangular faces that I did a side length of 6 on, which is 18. And then this one has all 3 of these, and they have side lengths of 4, so this would be 12, 16, and 20, just to give you another example. So side lengths of 4 for each of these, or a side length of 6 makes 18. Essentially, that side length is just, again, it's determining our side length. It's figuring out the initial perimeter we're working with for our spikes. If you're working with a platonic solid, all you really need to focus on is just one of these shapes. So for example, a dodecahedron, which is going to be my example in this video, we're only going to worry about the pentagons here. So I'm going to select a side length of 3 or 4 or whatever. And then all of my spikes will have the exact same perimeter and I won't have to think too much about it. If you are doing something that has multiple shapes for faces, so it's called a rhombicosa dodecahedron. It's got a really fun name. That's this guy. That's where it really does matter that you keep your side length consistent across all 3 shapes, and then you're making a different perimeter depending on the face that you're working. So if I'm working a pentagonal perimeter with a side length of 3, this one would be a 15 stitch perimeter. If I'm working a square perimeter with a side length of 3, this guy would be 12. So in a situation like this where you have different shapes for your faces, you need to keep that side length consistent, keep it all the same for all your different shapes, and then modify the length of your perimeter based off of the face you're working. You may also notice that some of my little things that I've worked have different colors and that the colors are not touching each other, other than like at these little corner bits. If you want to do something like this, you're going to want to look into what's called the 4-color theorem. Basically what it says is for stuff like we've talked about here, you will never need more than 4 colors to what's called color, great name, your shape. So when you're doing a coloring, you are making it so that you have each face a different color and none of them touch. You can find examples of this if you look up like the shape and then coloring. So if I wanted to do a coloring for this guy, which is a dodecahedron, I would just look up dodecahedron coloring and you should be able to find examples of that online. All right, now we're gonna get into the math that's a little bit more in detail, that's a little bit deeper level. It's not super deep, it's just a little bit more involved than working with like D&D dice type shapes that everyone is for the most part familiar with. So far we've been focused on shapes where the faces are all regular polygons. What that means is each side is the same length and all of the internal corners are all the same as well. Technically, you don't actually have to do that. You don't have to do regular polygons. So this is a rhombic tricontahedron and we can still use that for this. What really matters is as long as the side lengths have integer ratios. So these guys are made of rhombi, and each of these sides is the same length of each other. So it's sort of still following one of the like rules, you could say, for regular polygons where all of the sides are the same length. But you can see that the angles are different. As another example, if you had a shape that was sort of like a kite or something and you had side length ratios of 2 to 4, you could totally do that for this because as long as we have integer ratios of side lengths, we can use that for crochet stitches. You can't have fractional or decimal crochet stitches, that just doesn't exist. As long as your ratios are integers, you can totally do this. So just as another example, I have here a deltoidal hexacontahedron, and I've written down the side length ratio up here. It's a ratio of 1 to 7 plus root 5 over 6. So these shorter lengths are the ratio of 1, and then these longer ones are 7 plus root 5 over 6. We can't technically make this accurately with this technique due to this non-integer ratio over here. But that really only covers geometric shapes. You technically don't even have to use geometric shapes. You could freehand your spikes if you wanted to, and if you freehanded your spikes, everything's gonna have integer numbers of side lengths. So you could start with something that's like this. Just make a circle of your foundation single crochets and then just start working your spikes off the side. And maybe this is 2 stitches, this one's 5, 4, 3, 3, 2, I don't know. But as long as you are connecting them in a similar way, you can do this. You don't even have to do this with spherical objects at all. You could do some sort of weird little curvy thing as long as you're following the same sort of technique and sort of making these like little cells that you then work your spikes off of. So there's a lot you can do with this. Some of this might not make a ton of sense because I know we haven't covered the technique yet, but as soon as we do, this should start making a little bit more sense. All right, now that we've gotten all the math out of the way, we'll start covering how to actually make one of these things. I'm gonna be using an example of a dodecahedron, so that's gonna be this guy or your D12, right here. That's gonna be my example for this video. You can follow along with this example to make one of these along with me, or just follow along to learn the technique and work on a different shape if you'd prefer. All right, our first step for this is going to be choosing our shape. So you could be working with a platonic solid maybe, or something with different shapes, whatever. You're gonna be choosing your shape. So like I said, I'm gonna be working with a dodecahedron, which is this guy here. You can also think of it as a D12. There's a bunch of different ways to think about this, but I am working with a dodecahedron. So I've figured out the shape I'm making. Now I'm gonna choose my side length. I'm gonna do a side length of 3 for this example. That's just because that's what I've chose. If you choose 4, 5, it just means you're gonna end up with a bigger shape at the end. So I'm gonna note that down. Now I'm gonna calculate my perimeter. I have a side length of 3. I'm gonna multiply that by the number of sides that my faces have. So in this case, we're working with pentagons, which have 5 sides, making for a perimeter of 15 stitches. So these are kind of our first 2 numbers that we need to keep in mind when working with one of these. The next step is to plan out our rounds. I like doing this ahead of time before I get started working on one of these, just so I have something noted down somewhere as sort of a guide before I get started. There's a couple things to keep in mind when you're planning out your rounds. Number 1 is how we're decreasing during our decrease rounds, because that's how we're gonna make that spike. And the second thing is the stitch count for each round of our spike. So for our decrease rounds, what I suggest is decreasing the same number of times as there are sides on your face. What that means is I'm working with pentagonal faces which have 5 sides. That means that in each of my decrease rounds, I will be decreasing 5 times. This is mostly important if you have a shape that has multiple different sized or shaped faces. So for example, I would decrease 5 times on my decrease rounds for the pentagon, 4 times for my decrease rounds for the squares, and 3 times for my decrease rounds for my triangles. That just keeps everything consistent. So that's my recommendation for your decrease rounds when you're working on this. My other suggestion is that you don't let your number of stitches go below twice the number of sides for whatever face you're working. It tends to get a little bit more cylindrical at the end. It gets a little weird. You could do a single round where you're doing the same number of stitches as you have number of sides, but I personally don't go any more than that. What I mean by that is for this dodecahedron, I'm not going to go below a stitch count of 10. So 10 is twice the number of sides on this face, which is 5. So I'm not going to let my stitch count go below 10. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, I will write down my stitch count per round right now, so that you have a better idea of sort of what each of these means. So for my first round is just going to be my perimeter, and that's going to be a stitch count of 15. My second round, I'll also do a stitch count of 15, and same with my third, just building up that spike a little bit. I'll let my fourth round be a stitch count of 10, fifth round stitch count of 10, and sixth round a stitch count of 10 as well. So this would be my decrease round right here, where we move from 15 to 10. For this example, the actual written out stitch instructions would be something like single crochet, invisible decrease, times 5. And that's just to keep the decreases equidistant from each other around our round. And you can see that I haven't gone on to like a round 7 where I have a stitch count of 5. That's what I mean where we have twice the number of stitches as there are sides on the face. So I'm not making this any spikier than that. And these are just really, really rough instructions for me to follow as I'm making these spikes. These are just the total stitch count of each of these rounds. So I'm going to set that off to my side so I can reference it. If you end up not liking this later on, you can always frog your spikes, but make sure you edit wherever you have your spike instructions written down, just so you have a reference to keep all your spikes consistent. All right, now we're gonna actually get started crocheting. There's a lot of planning that goes into this if you're wanting to make something super geometric, but it helps to keep everything written down somewhere, make it easy to reference, makes it a lot easier when you're making one of these. So I've got my slip knot on my hook. I'm gonna start by making a foundation single crochet that is the same length as my perimeter, in my case 15 stitches. So I'm gonna foundation single crochet 15. All right, I've now got my foundation single crochet that is 15 stitches long. I'm gonna grab a stitch marker really quick and mark the last stitch of this row. From here, I'm now going to be following my stitch instructions that I've written down over here. So my second round is going to also be 15 stitches. So I'm going to close my foundation single crochet into a loop, making sure that I don't have anything twisted. It looks like this. Nothing is twisted up, and I'm gonna put my first single crochet into the top of the first foundation single crochet. And that has secured our ring. And I'm just now doing 15 normal single crochets all the way around. So I'm just gonna keep following my stitch count per each round. So I'm currently on round 2, single crocheting 15 all the way around again. When I get back to the start this time, I'll be moving on to my decrease round. And I wrote it out earlier where it was single crochet, invisible decrease. And we're gonna repeat that 5 times for our decrease round. That just keeps all of our decreases equidistant from each other, evenly spaced out and everything. So I'm gonna do single crochet and then an invisible decrease. You can do a normal single crochet decrease instead of an invisible decrease if you prefer. I am just doing invisible decreases because we are working continuous rounds, and invisible decreases tend to work better for continuous round crochet stuff. But yeah, I'm literally following the stitch count that I wrote down earlier for each round of this spike. All right, and that was the last stitch of this spike. Again, I'm ending on a round with 10 stitches. I don't want to go down to 5. I find it makes it just a little bit too spiky for my liking. So I am going to grab my scissors and cut my yarn now because I have finished with my first spike. And there we go. Also going to take this opportunity to close the spikes. You can do this now, you can do this later. I like to do this as I go along. So the way I close my spikes is the way I'd close anything with amigurumi, where I'm going in through the front loops of each of these stitches, which I can then later cinch shut. So I'm just going to go along through the front loops of each of these guys. Now that I'm through the front loops, I just pull that shut. You can see that we're cinching the top of that shut. Looks like my yarn might have gotten a little caught in itself in a couple of places, which sucks, but there we go. Now we just closed up that hole at the top. I can now weave this in and hide the end. All right, now we're gonna be starting our second spike. We wanna be able to connect these to each other, and we're gonna be doing that by crocheting directly into the base of the first spike. If you look at this, you can see the bottoms of our foundation single crochets have left all these little loops that we can then work into. And that's exactly what we're gonna do to connect each of these spikes to each other. So I'm going to get a slip knot on my hook, and I'm gonna attach this to this with a standing single crochet. So a standing single crochet just means I insert my hook, and then I work my single crochet as if I was already connected to something. So one more time, slip knot on my hook, go in, pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through 2. That's all there is to it. So I've taken this back out, but the number of stitches we're gonna work into the base here, the base of our spike, is the same as the side length of our face. So each of these, where is my little paper? There's my little paper. Each of these faces are connected to each other by a side. That means that each of them share that side length of stitches. So because I have a side length of 3, these 2 faces are going to be connected by 3 stitches. So I'm going to crochet half of them. So I'm going to do 1, get that tail out of the way, 1 single crochet, 2 single crochets. So that's about half of the total stitches. And the reason I'm working half of them is so that I can work my foundation single crochet root loop out and back and reconnect it right here. So now I need to work the rest of my perimeter, and we're going to do that with foundation single crochets. In this case, I'm going to need to foundation single crochet 12 because my perimeter is 15 stitches. We have 3 of those accounted for in this spike already. 15 minus 3 is 12, so that's going to be 12 foundation single crochets. And I'm doing this by working, starting in the same space as that last single crochet I did to extend this piece. So that's covered a little bit more in detail in a video I have that's called like foundation single crochet to extend. It's just a way to extend something you're working on or work outwards from something you're working on using foundation single crochet. So I'm going to do 12 total of these guys. All right, so that is my last foundation single crochet. I'm now going to go back right behind this and connect it. So I'm going to flip this, again making sure that nothing is twisted, that my loop is fully not twisted, it's all flat all the way around on top. I'll put my last single crochet right behind the first one. If you were working, say, something that had a side length of 6 and you had 3 stitches left to go, you would need to go back 3 more stitches. So you would want to start here and work 1, 2, 3 single crochets to get back to the start. But I just have 1 left, so I'm going directly behind my first stitch to finish it up there. From here, we're literally following that same set of stitch instructions as we had for the first spike. So for me, that's going to be single crochet 15, single crochet 15, then do my decrease round, and then 2 rounds of single crochet 10. Also, really quick, I want to note that the reason why we're not starting from a foundation single crochet, crocheting 3 across here, and then foundation single crocheting back to the start, is because this looks a lot cleaner than if you were to do that. So if you were to do foundation single crochet rings the whole time, you end up with all of these little jogs in your work, which kind of sucks. Doing this, you can see they end up, the first and last stitch end up right next to each other, and then we are mitigating that jog. So if I look at this star that I made, you can see all these little bumps because I worked starting with a foundation single crochet rather than working directly into the base of existing stitches. But yeah, from there on, I'm literally following that same set of stitch instructions as I had for my first spike. And we'll cover a way to mitigate the jog from your first spike as well at the end. I want to cover that at the end because I don't want to add more complications than what this already has to it. So I'm avoiding that for now, and we'll cover how to deal with that at the end of this section of the video. All right, so that is 2 of our spikes done. You can see they are directly connected to each other at the base. Now for the third one. This is where it's going to get a little bit different depending on what shape you're working. In my case, the dodecahedron has 3 faces connected at a single point, so that's what I'm going to be showing you here. You might be working something that has 4 faces connecting at a point, or maybe even 5, and that works a little bit differently. So if I have, use this little corner up here, so I have a situation where I have 3 faces connecting in a point like this. That means that if I shade these 2 in, those 2 are already done. This third face will work, let's get a little different color actually. This face will work through both of them to connect them, and then foundation single crochet this edge, which is new, back to the start. If I were doing something that had 4 faces connecting at a point, I would have these 2 faces done, so I'll shade those in to show that we have completed them. Our new face would be working off of just one of these guys because we have 4 of them connecting at a point. So then our 4th face would be the one that would connect these 2 together, like that. So if you have 4 faces connecting at a point, you would be repeating basically what we just did, where we're working off of one of these existing points to make the new one. You're going to want to line it up right next to both of them. So you're going to use, for example, these. I'm going to focus on the thing. You would be using these 3 stitches to connect to either this point, or you could, flip it over and do these 3, doesn't really matter. You're going to want to use the 3 stitches that are directly adjacent to the other point to connect your new spike. And then the same thing goes if you have 5 stitches or 5 faces meeting at a point. Do this really quick. If we had these 2 existing, you would still be, oh, there goes the marker. You'd still be adding this guy on as we just did, but then you'd add another one on as we just did before finally connecting 2 faces together with this one. So this section is basically on how to connect 2 faces together with your new face or your new spike. So now I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to get a slip knot back on my hook with my new yarn. All right, so I'm going to now attach my 3rd spike here. This is going to be a little bit different if you're left versus right-handed, because if you are right-handed, you work this way towards your left, and if you're left-handed, you work this way towards your right. So for me, I'm going to get my slip knot on my hook, and I'm going to start in the right spike working towards my left. Because I am right-handed, I work towards my left. If you're left-handed, you're going to work on your left spike working towards your right. I prefer doing this. It's not super critical, but I prefer to work as many stitches, like as many single crochets, starting before doing my foundation single crochet and attaching back at the start. That's just how I work this. Again, this is just a technique. Everybody's going to have their own variation on what they like for this sort of thing. So, starting at the juncture, like the point where these 2 meet, I'm going to find my side length of stitches that I'll work. So again, for me, I'm finding that on my right point because I am right-handed. So for me, that is, if I get this to focus, that is this guy here, and this guy here, these 3 loops. I'm going to go about halfway between them. I'm going to go in the middle, which is this guy here, and that's where I'm going to work my standing single crochet. I'm going to work my next one into the next stitch, and now I'm going to work into my 2nd spike. So I'm going to find the next 3 stitches for this guy. So that's going to be, they can be a little bit tricky to figure out. If you ever have any trouble, you can always just count the base stitches and find the final 3. For me, that is this one here, and this one over here. So I'm going to single crochet into those 3. So 1, 2, 3. Again, that is my side length. That is how these faces are connected. Now, here's the other thing about this. You can see that there's quite a few little gaps in here. There's not a great way to mitigate it, but what I tend to do is when I am connecting these faces together, I will do sort of a decrease to try and mitigate that gapping. So in my case, I will work, say, for example, this little orange guy that this blue piece is coming out of. I'll grab this one and that first stitch just to try and close it up a little bit more. You can see that that's kind of our problem area there. So what I could even do is I could have taken this one out and had a decrease on the blue spike as well. That might have decreased that gapping a little bit, but there's not a really good way to get rid of that. These decreases are kind of my way of dealing with that. So I've done my 3 stitches, my side length into my 2nd spike. Now I'm finishing out my perimeter with that foundation single crochet. In this case, I'm going to be foundation single crocheting 9 because I have, you can either think of it as I have 3 sides left to complete, so 3 times 3 is 9, or I would have 15 total stitches. 6 of them are accounted for by these 2 sides, and 15 minus 6 is 9. Either way, I need to foundation single crochet 9 before I get back to the start. So there's my foundation single crochet 9. I'm gonna loop this around, again, making sure that nothing is twisted, everything is flush, and I do my last single crochet right before the first one. Put my stitch marker back in, and I'm once again back to following my stitch instructions for my spike. This is why I say it's really good to write them down. It can be hard to remember these if this is a project that you put down and come back to, or if you have a bunch of different faces that you're working. It's just really useful to have something at hand to go back and reference if you're a little unsure of what you've been doing so far. All right, and there is my last stitch for this third spike. I'm gonna do, again, same thing, cutting my yarn and weaving the end in, closing up that hole. All right, and that is our first 3 spikes done. Yours might look a little bit different if you're working a shape that is not a dodecahedron or is something that has more than 3 spikes meeting at a single point. But from here on, essentially what you're gonna be doing is referencing whatever shape you're working on, whatever face you're working next, and seeing how they connect and basically working it however they connect. Again, this is like a technique tutorial. It's gonna be really self-guided depending on what shape you're working. So for me, again, dodecahedrons all have 3 faces meeting at the same point. So my next spike could be here, or could be here. There's different options. It's really just following whatever shape you're working on. And I said I was going to talk about how to get rid of this jog, so let's do that really quick. I've got my loop on my hook so that I can make a new side, and if you were to count the loops on the bottom of this foundation single crochet ring from your first spike, you would probably find that there is 1 more loop on the bottom than there are foundation single crochets that you did. So for me, I foundation single crocheted 15, I would find 16 loops on the bottom here. And in fact, if I count these up, I should have 9 loops on the bottom here because there are 3 sides yet to be attached. So if I start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's this guy here, 9, 10, and I should have 9. So what I do is I get rid of that loop and that jog at the same time. So just as an example, I'll put my little standing single crochet here just so I can attach it. And what I do is I decrease through this guy here and through that bonus loop. So I think I might have, nope, that's the right spot. I go in through here, can be a little tricky, and then I work my 3rd stitch. So now I should have 6 loops here, and in fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 6 loops across this remaining section, and I've sort of mitigated that jog there. You can get rid of it a little bit more by pulling that slip knot through to the other side, and you can see we've really cleaned up that edge just by adding in that decrease. A little bit of focus on there. It's a lot cleaner looking than it was before, and now I can just work this face just as we did all before. And then so far we've only covered working into 2 existing faces, but as you continue with this, you might have 3 existing faces your new spike will need to work into, or 4. So again, you're just referencing whatever shape you're working on. If I had like another face here and I was working this yellow one, I would be working into these 3 faces with this new yellow spike. I hope that all makes sense, and I hope that was useful. This is definitely a very, very structured overview of this technique. So a bunch of the rules that I've set out here are really just guidelines. If you want to put all your decreases to one side of your spike and make it lean, or do no decreases at all and just have them be cylinders, go for it. This is just the way that I tend to approach stuff like this, and is the way that I made all 3 of these, was using this set of standards. Not set of standards, that makes it feel like it's a engineering handbook. This set of rules that aren't really rules and are guidelines. There are definitely a ton of things that I still want to experiment with regards to this, including making just cylindrical sides or freehanding the spikes or anything. There's a ton of things to do with this because it's just a thing to do with crochet. There's not really actual rules here. So one of the things I really do like about this is the fact that it's no sew. I haven't figured out a way to make geometric shapes with flat faces that is no sew yet. I don't know if that's possible, but I have figured out that you can use flat faces in conjunction with like spiked faces like we've done here or here with our little example, and make stuff like this. So for this example of a star, this is essentially a pentagonal prism. Yeah, I think it's a prism, yeah. Where we have flat faces for our pentagons, and then we have these square faces that are made using this spiking technique. So each of these pentagons starts with a magic circle, and we build these guys first. We're using the same rules of assigning a side length and then figuring out our overall perimeter. So for example, I think that this one has a side length of 4. So my magic circle for these flat faces, we have pentagons with a perimeter of 20. Oh, and we're not focused. And we have squares with a perimeter of 16. And these are worked center out, whereas the squares are worked outside in. So you could definitely do this with other shapes. So for example, I could do this where I make the pentagons and triangles flat using magic circles and spike the squares, or vice versa, make the squares flat and spike the pentagons and triangles. But that's the only way I can think of to make something using this no sew. I don't exactly know how to make something that is just flat-faced no sew. That might be another project for another time. The other thing you can do with this, and the thing that actually led to me sort of discovering this, is you can use this to separate legs on like an amigurumi thing. So if you had a round like that, and you wanted to separate this into 4 legs, what you could do is, if I grab my other marker again, say your round starts here. You can start working around and then start making your split with your foundation single crochets before going back into the start. And then you can do the same thing over here, starting here, working around a little bit, coming back in, working into the shared loop, like the shared stitches, before going back around. So there's a ton of different things you can do with this just on account of it being like an application of foundation single crochets, essentially. There are definitely tons of other applications for this that I haven't messed around with. I'll be doing a tutorial on these stars at some point in the future as well, so if you're interested, keep an eye out for that. But please explore with this. I think it's super cool. I think it's fun to work with. They make really weird decorations, and it's really fun for somebody to ask you what you're working on, and you go, oh, it's a rhombicosed dodecahedron, and then they look at you like you're crazy. I think that's hilarious. Anyways, that is my crochet geometry tutorial. I hope that all makes sense. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And if anything was unclear, I will try to do a follow-up tutorial or respond to comments or something like that to make sure everything is clear on this technique, because I know it's weird and I know it's a little hard to explain. Trust me, this is the 3rd time I've tried recording this. It's really difficult to explain. If you did find this helpful or interesting, consider donating to my Ko-Fi. I put a ton of work into this to make sure it all made sense. This is my 3rd time recording this because the past 2 times weren't great. But I try to make all of these tutorials as useful as possible, and I put them all up for free so that people can access them and learn new crochet things. So if you did find this useful, Ko-Fi is a great way to help support the channel and also my website. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I look forward to seeing what you guys make with this, and I hope to see you around. Bye.